The question is that this House has considered the infected blood inquiry. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The infected blood scandal is one of the most painful and shameful chapters in the history of the British state. For decades, hundreds of individuals with bleeding disorders and other conditions were infected with HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, due to the use of contaminated blood products such as factor VIII and factor IX, often imported from overseas. These infections were not only preventable, but there were warnings from the medical community that were ignored by successive governments and by the National Health Service. The victims and their families have endured unimaginable suffering, including the loss of loved ones, social stigma, and many have even been tragically blamed for their own illnesses. The health service, which was supposed to be there for them, to treat them, to heal them and look after them, and the parts of the state that were supposed to protect them, betrayed them. The institutions of this country failed these victims and their families at such a scale that it is almost beyond comprehension. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased that this subject has been brought forward to be debated today. A subject as important as this deserves to be thoroughly discussed in this House. And as this is my first debate as Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, I would like to put on record that while there will be much that the Right Honourable Gentleman and I will disagree on, this issue is not one of them. He can be sure of our support as he works to put right a historic wrong, a wrong that continues to have a devastating impact on families across the country. It is simply beyond party politics. And I thank the Paymaster General for his update in the House today and for the tone and the tenor which he has already struck in this place since the general election. The infected blood inquiry established in 2017 by the former Prime Minister Theresa May was only achieved because of the tireless efforts of victims and their families. But that inquiry has shed a horrifying light on the true scale of the tragedy. And I echo the Paymaster General's thanks to Sir Brian and to his team for the great service that they have given in conducting this inquiry. It stands as a testament to the power of the victims' voices and the need for transparency, justice and accountability at all levels. Whilst I'm here today on behalf of His Majesty's opposition, I would like to reiterate the words of the previous Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton, when he apologised not only on behalf of the previous government, but on behalf of governments stretching back to the 1970s. This sentiment, I know, is shared by the current leader of the opposition and the whole of our party. We are truly sorry the successive governments and the NHS failed to listen to the medical experts, victims and their families. And this inquiry shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. A great many of its victims and loved ones have sadly died before they ever saw the truth being acknowledged. I am pleased that this government and the previous government have publicly recognised the scale of the damage done, acknowledged the mistakes that were made, and most importantly, are now taking steps to try to make some amends and to provide support and compensation for its many victims. We on this side of the House will continue to support the government's ambition to make the first payments before the end of this year. It is important that the government is pushing ahead with the compensation scheme, which is of the size and scale which is rightfully deserved by victims, including those who are sadly now deceased, and their families, and that it will take into account all of the medical, financial and emotional suffering. As I have said, he will have our full support on this side of the House. An apology is, as he has said, meaningless without not just redress, but redress at speed. In addition, I also hope that the Right Honourable Gentleman will be working further with the Health Secretary to help implement stronger medical screening protocols, as well as safety measures to ensure that the UK's blood supply continues to be safe and free from contamination. A scandal like this cannot be allowed to ever happen again. And so the government must continue to ensure that global standards for blood safety are met and regularly updated. This includes improving regulations where appropriate around the sourcing of blood products, constantly updating where possible methods for virus detection. It is important that we further enhance training and education for our healthcare professionals regarding ethical practices, patient consent, and the safe use of medical products. And whilst I know that a lot has changed in the National Health Service in the nearly 50 years since the start of the scandal, a key aspect of the total failure was that lack of informed consent, the failure of healthcare professionals to adequately communicate the risks that were associated with treatment. And as this inquiry has shown, there are numerous cases of disrespectful attitudes towards infected patients, completely unacceptable. Patients who are often blamed for their condition or treated as though they are a burden. As the inquiry has recommended, the training must include the ethics procedures as well as patient-centred care. This scandal, sadly, is a painful case study on what happens when this is not the case. Medical staff in the NHS should always approach patients with dignity and empathy, as we know that almost all do on a daily basis, ensuring that all risks and benefits are clearly communicated and the rights of patients are upheld. Adding to this point, and perhaps more broadly in society, we must continue the great work of recent years in destigmatising those with conditions such as HIV and hepatitis. And I note the exceptional work of the Terence Higgins Trust in the former in particular. As has been previously said, the victims of the infected blood scandal were not only victims of the NHS and the many government's failings, but also they were victims of social stigma and discrimination. As the inquiry found, many faced vilification. This despite the fact that many had received contaminated blood products through the same NHS that was blaming them through no fault of their own. And so I encourage the government to continue with public education campaigns to combat that stigma surrounding blood-borne viruses and HIV, as well as implementing better protections in the workplace and public life, so that we can be sure that those infected are not subject to the pain of further discrimination. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to put on record my own thanks. My thanks to the brave victims and their families. As I said at the start of my speech, we would not be here today if it was not for them. Their campaigning, their hard work, their faith to keep going when nothing seemed to be changing, when the message simply didn't seem to be getting through. Their relentlessness to fight, knowing that a great injustice had been done, their love for their friends and family members, many of whom are sadly no longer with us today, who are all impacted by this terrible situation. Their courage is truly awe-inspiring, and no amount of compensation will ever undo the great tragedy. So great is the pain and the suffering which they have been through, but I sincerely hope that moving forward, that perhaps one day they will have some peace. Peace in the knowledge that they have been listened to by their government and their health service, and that all their hard years of campaigning, the abuse and vile vitriol which many have faced, was not for nothing. That in the end, after far, far too long, they have indeed been heard. And that because of all their combined efforts and sacrifices, we can come together now to help make sure that something like this will never happen again. They have moved the nation and this Parliament with their deeply personal stories, and we are all sorry, deeply sorry, for everything that they have been through, for everything and everyone who they have lost. And I thank them all for their extraordinary bravery.
Yeah.